Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from the Appalachian Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1905, and winter had descended upon the remote hollows of McDowell County, West Virginia, with unusual cruelty. Those familiar with the region know that these mountains hold their secrets like few other places on Earth. What happened in these hills, specifically in the isolated community of Beartown, has been systematically removed from official records, mentioned only in fragmented newspaper clippings and yellowed journals kept by those who witnessed the events firsthand. The Blackburn family homestead stood 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, accessible only by a narrow dirt path that wound through dense woodland. The property had been in the family for generations, passed down from father to son since before the Civil War. Thomas Blackburn, a man approaching his 50th year, his wife Martha, and his younger brother Elias, lived on this remote parcel of land, sustaining themselves through hunting, limited farming, and occasional work at the Algoma coal mine 12 miles east. What makes this case particularly unsettling is not just what was discovered in the Blackburn homestead on February 17, 1905, but the systematic attempt to erase it from history. County records were purged. Newspaper accounts mysteriously disappeared from archives. Even the official census data from 1900 shows curious omissions around the Beartown area. According to surviving accounts, it was Jeremiah Powell, a traveling peddler who visited the remote communities of McDowell County once every 2 months, who first alerted authorities. Powell had been making his regular rounds, bringing supplies, tools, and news to the isolated families scattered throughout the hollows. The Blackburn homestead was typically his third stop on his northern route through Beartown. What he found there would eventually lead to one of the most disturbing investigations in Appalachian history. Powell later stated in his testimony that as he approached the Blackburn property, he immediately sensed something was wrong. The chimney, which should have been billowing smoke in the February cold, stood dormant. The family's mule was still in the small barn, but appeared severely malnourished. Most telling was the absence of footprints in the 3-day-old snow surrounding the cabin. Upon reaching the cabin door, Powell called out, but received no response. After several attempts, he pushed open the door, which was unusually unlocked. The peddler's official statement, preserved in a partial court transcript discovered in 1961, described the interior as unnaturally cold, as if the winter had somehow seeped into the very boards of the floor. The hearth contained only cold ashes, suggesting no fire had been lit for days. The Blackburn family was nowhere to be found. Their few possessions appeared undisturbed. A half-prepared meal sat on the table, cornbread and beans, now covered in mold, suggesting they had been abandoned mid-preparation several days prior. A rifle still hung above the door. The family Bible lay open on a small side table. What disturbed Powell most, according to his testimony, was the total silence of the place. In his words, "It wasn't just quiet. It was empty in a way that made my ears hurt, like the silence itself had weight. I've delivered goods to empty cabins before, when folks were out hunting or visiting, but this was different. The Blackburn place felt like it had been hollowed out from the inside." Powell rode 17 miles to the sheriff's office in Welch, where he reported his findings to Sheriff William Hatfield, a distant relation of the infamous Anderson Devil Anse Hatfield from the legendary feud decades earlier. Initially, Hatfield dismissed Powell's concerns, suggesting the family had likely gone to visit relatives or perhaps had left to seek medical attention in a larger town. February was a harsh month, and it wasn't uncommon for mountain families to temporarily relocate during particularly severe weather. However, Powell insisted something was amiss. The abandoned meal, the malnourished mule, the unlocked door, these details suggested a hasty and unplanned departure. More compelling was Powell's insistence that Thomas Blackburn would never have left his property unlocked or his animals uncared for, regardless of the circumstances. In 15 years of trading with Thomas Blackburn, Powell reportedly told the sheriff, "I've never known him to leave so much as a tool outside overnight, let alone his door unbarred." Reluctantly, Sheriff Hatfield assembled a small party consisting of himself, Deputy James Rutherford, and local physician Dr. Samuel Thornton. They set out for the Blackburn homestead the following morning, February 18th. The journey took most of the day due to poor trail conditions. They arrived as dusk was settling over the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow-covered clearing where the cabin stood. Their initial observations matched Powell's account. The cabin appeared abandoned but undisturbed. No signs of struggle were evident. The family's few valuables, a silver pocket watch, a small lockbox containing roughly $15, and Martha Blackburn's wedding band, found on the bedside table, remained in the cabin, suggesting robbery was not a motive for their disappearance. It was Dr. Thornton who first noticed what would become the first truly disturbing element of the case. In the bedroom, the physician observed unusual stains on the wooden floorboards beside the bed. Initially dismissed as spilled food or drink, closer examination suggested something more concerning. Dr. Thornton noted in his medical journal, later recovered from his personal effects after his death in 1929, that the stains appeared to be biological in nature, though he refrained from explicitly identifying them as blood in his official report. The pattern of the staining, Thornton wrote privately, suggested not a single incident of spillage, but rather a repeated dripping over time, as if someone had stood in the same position beside the bed on multiple occasions while carrying something that leaked or dripped. The wood had absorbed the substance deeply, suggesting this had occurred over weeks, possibly months. Sheriff Hatfield ordered a more thorough search of the property. Deputy Rutherford examined the surrounding area and made a discovery that significantly altered the course of the investigation. Approximately 40 yards behind the cabin, partially obscured by brambles and low-hanging pine branches, Rutherford found what appeared to be a small root cellar or storage space dug into the hillside. The wooden door securing this underground room was padlocked from the outside. Breaking the lock required considerable effort, suggesting it was relatively new. When the door finally gave way, the men were met with a rush of stale, cold air that, according to Rutherford's statement, carried an odor unlike anything I had encountered before, not the expected smell of stored vegetables or preserved meats, but something far more unsettling. The sheriff's initial report described the underground room as approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, with an earthen floor and rough-hewn timber walls. What they found inside fundamentally changed the nature of their investigation. The space contained several unusual items. Most notably hanging from the low ceiling were what Dr. Thornton described as primitive preservation tools, similar to those used by hunters to dress and preserve game, but with modifications that served no apparent practical purpose. The implements included curved hooks fashioned from deer antlers, various knives with handles wrapped in unfamiliar materials, and several tools that appeared to be designed for specific but unidentifiable purposes. Along the walls stood 3 large barrels, their contents not disclosed in the official report. A small table held various implements, including several handcrafted knives of unusual design, and a collection of glass jars containing unidentified substances. Dr. Thornton's private notes described these substances as viscous fluids of varying colors, some containing suspended organic materials preserved in what appeared to be alcohol or similar spirit. Perhaps most disturbing was a leather-bound journal discovered on a small shelf near the entrance. The journal, written in Thomas Blackburn's hand according to those familiar with his writing, contained entries dating back approximately 7 months. The contents of this journal were considered so disturbing that Sheriff Hatfield confiscated it immediately, and only fragmentary descriptions of its contents have survived in subsequent reports. What we do know, based on testimony given during the closed inquest that followed, is that the journal detailed Thomas Blackburn's apparent descent into an obsessive state. The entries reportedly began rationally enough, with mundane descriptions of daily life in the hollow. However, as the months progressed, the writings became increasingly erratic and focused on what Blackburn referred to as the hunger in the hills and voices carried by the wind. One entry from September 1904, partially quoted in Dr. Thornton's notes, read, "The hunger speaks clearest at dusk, when the shadows lengthen and the boundary between day and night grows thin. It has shown me things hidden in the trees, in the rocks, in the very soil beneath our feet. Things that have always been there, watching and waiting. Elias thinks I'm losing my mind, but soon he will hear it too." Another fragment, dated November 1904, stated, "3 nights without sleep now. The voices won't let me rest. They speak of ancient things, of a time before men walked these hills, when the forest was vast and unbroken. They say we are intruders here, all except those who listen, those who serve, those who feed the hunger." The final entry, dated February 14, 1905, contained only the cryptic phrase, "We cannot remain. It has found us." Upon completing their initial investigation of the underground room, the search party returned to the cabin. With this new context, they conducted a more thorough examination of the residence. Behind a cupboard in the main room, Deputy Rutherford discovered a narrow door leading to a previously unnoticed side room. This space, measuring approximately 6 by 8 feet, contained a single chair facing the wall. The wall itself was covered in unusual markings, symbols, and text written in what appeared to be charcoal and other substances. Dr. Thornton's notes described them as reminiscent of astronomical charts, though corrupted by elements that suggest a deeply disturbed mind. The central motif, Thornton wrote, appeared to be a series of concentric circles from which radiated lines connecting to smaller circles, forming a pattern not unlike a celestial map. Interspersed among these were symbols resembling alphabetic characters from no language I could identify. Most disturbing was the evident care and precision with which these markings had been made. This was not the random scrawling of madness, but rather a methodical attempt to document or communicate something of great importance to the Creator. As night fell, Sheriff Hatfield decided the investigation would continue the following day. The men secured the property and traveled to the nearest neighbor, the Davidson family, who lived 3 miles southeast of the Blackburn homestead. Jacob Davidson and his wife Esther received the men and provided them lodging for the night. When questioned about the Blackburns, the Davidsons' responses were curiously guarded. According to Sheriff Hatfield's notes, Jacob Davidson admitted he hadn't seen Thomas or any of the Blackburns in nearly 3 weeks, despite previously maintaining a relatively close relationship with the family. When pressed further, Davidson revealed that his last interaction with Thomas Blackburn had been troubling. "He came to our door before dawn," Davidson stated. "He seemed agitated, not himself. He kept looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to be there. He asked if we'd been hearing the sounds at night. When I asked what sounds, he just stared at me for a long while and then said, 'It's been watching us for months.' It's in the trees." Davidson reported that Blackburn left abruptly, and that was the last time he saw him. When asked if he had reported this strange behavior to anyone, Davidson admitted he had not. "Folks keep to themselves in these hills," he explained. "A man's business is his own." Esther Davidson, when questioned separately, provided additional concerning details. She reported that in the months leading up to their disappearance, Martha Blackburn had confided that Thomas was behaving strangely. "She told me he would spend hours staring into the forest," Esther recalled, "sometimes talking to himself or to something he claimed was out there. She said he hardly slept anymore, and when he did, he would wake screaming about eyes in the dark." Most troubling was Esther's recollection of her final conversation with Martha in late January. "She seemed frightened," Esther stated, "not just worried about Thomas, but afraid for herself. She asked me if we would take her in if she needed to leave suddenly. When I asked why she would need to do such a thing, she just said, "Thomas isn't himself anymore, and I fear Elias is starting to change too." The following morning, February 19th, Sheriff Hatfield expanded the search to include the surrounding forest. 6 men from nearby properties joined the effort, forming search parties that combed the densely wooded hills around the Blackburn property. Their efforts yielded no immediate signs of the missing family. No footprints were found in the snow beyond the immediate vicinity of the cabin, suggesting the Blackburns had either left before the recent snowfall or had not left on foot. It was late afternoon when Elijah Moore, one of the local men assisting in the search, made a discovery in a ravine approximately a half-mile northwest of the cabin. Moore initially spotted what he thought was a fallen tree branch protruding from the snow. Upon closer inspection, he realized it was a human arm. Sheriff Hatfield and Dr. Thornton were summoned immediately. The subsequent excavation of the site revealed the body of an adult male, later identified as Elias Blackburn, Thomas's younger brother. The body was partially concealed beneath snow and deliberately covered with branches and stones. Dr. Thornton's examination suggested Elias had been deceased for approximately 4 to 5 days, placing his death around February 14th or 15th, coinciding with the final entry in Thomas Blackburn's journal. The condition of Elias Blackburn's remains was the first indication that whatever had occurred at the homestead was far beyond the realm of ordinary criminal activity. Dr. Thornton's medical report, of which only fragments survive in the McDowell County Historical Society archives, describes injuries inconsistent with any conventional assault or accident. The report notes evidence of systematic excisions and methodical alterations to the body that suggested not a frenzied attack but a deliberate procedure of some kind. In his private journal, Dr. Thornton was more explicit. The body exhibited multiple precise incisions along the torso and limbs, following what appeared to be predetermined patterns rather than random attacks. Several major muscle groups had been carefully removed, as had certain internal organs. Most disturbing was the evident surgical precision of the work. These were not the wounds of rage or conventional violence, but rather the methodical dissections of someone with at least rudimentary anatomical knowledge. Perhaps most disturbing was Dr. Thornton's observation that many of the wounds appeared to have been inflicted while Elias was still alive, as evidenced by certain physiological indicators. The doctor's personal journal, discovered decades later, contains a more candid assessment. In my 30 years of medical practice, I have never encountered injuries that suggest such deliberate and prolonged suffering, nor such apparent purpose in their infliction. This was not murder in any ordinary sense. It was something else entirely. Another troubling detail noted by Dr. Thornton was the presence of unusual markings on Elias's skin, specifically a series of symbols carved into his back that matched some of the markings found on the walls of the hidden room in the Blackburn cabin. The carvings were shallow but precise, Thornton wrote, and appeared to have been executed with a fine-tipped implement, perhaps a needle or awl. They formed a circular pattern approximately 8 inches in diameter between the shoulder blades, containing symbols identical to those in the cabin. Most remarkable was the evident care taken in their creation. These were not hasty scratches, but deliberate inscriptions. The discovery of Elias Blackburn's body transformed the missing persons investigation into a murder inquiry. Sheriff Hatfield immediately dispatched Deputy Rutherford to Welch to telegraph for additional law enforcement support from neighboring counties and to alert state authorities. The search continued until nightfall, but no further bodies were discovered. The following day, February 20th, brought reinforcements from neighboring counties. The search area was expanded to a 3-mile radius around the Blackburn property. It was during this expanded search that the investigation took another disturbing turn. Approximately 2 miles southwest of the cabin, in a dense thicket of rhododendron near a small seasonal creek, searchers discovered what appeared to be a makeshift camp. A crude lean-to had been constructed using branches and a piece of canvas that was later identified as matching material from the Blackburn cabin's storage. The ground around this shelter showed signs of recent occupation. A small, carefully constructed fire pit containing ashes estimated to be no more than 36 hours old, and impressions in the earth suggesting someone had been sleeping or resting there. Most notably, investigators found a small cloth sack containing several personal items belonging to Martha Blackburn, including a hairbrush containing strands of gray-blonde hair matching her description and a small devotional book with her name inscribed on the inside cover. Also discovered was a kitchen knife from the Blackburn home and approximately 3 days' worth of food provisions, salted meat wrapped in cloth, and a small sack of cornmeal. What troubled investigators was the condition of the campsite. Despite evidence of recent occupation, it appeared to have been abandoned in haste. The fire had not been properly extinguished, but had instead burned itself out. The food provisions were not packed but scattered, as if dropped suddenly. Most concerning was a trail of disturbed snow and broken undergrowth, leading away from the campsite into a particularly dense section of forest, a trail that suggested someone had fled in panic rather than departed deliberately. The discovery suggested that Martha Blackburn might have fled the homestead and attempted to survive in the forest. But why she would choose to hide in the wilderness during February, one of the harshest months in the Appalachian winter, remained a troubling question. More concerning was the absence of any tracks leading away from the disturbed area, despite the recent snowfall that should have preserved such evidence. Sheriff Hatfield organized the expanded search party into systematic groups to comb the area around the discovered campsite. As dusk approached on February 20th, one of these groups, led by Deputy Marshal Conrad from neighboring Wyoming County, reported hearing what they described as a woman's voice calling out from a densely wooded ravine approximately a quarter-mile from the campsite. The men followed the sounds to their apparent source, but found no one. Conrad's official statement notes that the voice seemed to shift location as they pursued it, eventually falling silent as darkness descended on the forest. The voice was unmistakably human and female, Conrad stated. It appeared to be calling for help, though no distinct words could be discerned. What was most unusual was how the sound seemed to move. When we approached its apparent source, it would suddenly seem to come from another direction entirely, always just beyond our reach. As the light failed, the calls became less frequent before ceasing altogether. Superstitious fear began to spread among the search party. Several local men refused to continue searching after nightfall, citing old folk beliefs about the dangers of certain hollows after dark. Sheriff Hatfield, pragmatic by nature, dismissed these concerns publicly, but privately instructed his deputies to keep the search groups close together and to maintain constant communication. One local volunteer, Abraham Jenkins, a lifelong resident of McDowell County, expressed particular concern about the area where the voice had been heard. "That hollow has always had a bad reputation," Jenkins reportedly told Sheriff Hatfield. Old-timers called it Whispering Hollow because folks claimed to hear voices there even when no one was around. "My grandfather used to say the trees there grew crooked because they were trying to get away from something beneath the ground." The search resumed at first light on February 21st. The focus remained on the area where Deputy Conrad's group had heard the voice. Mid-morning, the search party made their most significant discovery yet. At the bottom of a steep ravine, partially submerged in a shallow pool formed by the creek, they found Martha Blackburn. Unlike her brother-in-law, she was alive, though in a severely compromised condition. Dr. Thornton's initial assessment at the scene described her as suffering from exposure, dehydration, and what appeared to be self-inflicted wounds on her hands and forearms. Most concerning was her mental state. She was entirely non-responsive to questions, alternating between periods of catatonic silence and frantic muttering that witnesses described as neither prayer nor sensible speech. Her condition was grave, Dr. Thornton noted. Beyond the physical trauma of exposure to winter conditions, she exhibited signs of severe psychological disturbance. Her eyes were wide and constantly moving, scanning the forest canopy above as if tracking the movement of something unseen. When touched or moved, she would react with brief but intense panic before lapsing back into her unresponsive state. Martha was immediately transported to the nearest proper medical facility, a small hospital in Welch. Dr. Thornton accompanied her, attempting to stabilize her condition during the difficult journey out of the mountains. According to his medical notes, Martha regained brief moments of lucidity during the journey, during which she made several disturbing statements. "He's still in the woods," she reportedly said at one point. "Thomas is looking for me, but it's not Thomas anymore. It hasn't been Thomas for months." When Dr. Thornton attempted to question her about what had happened at the homestead, Martha became agitated, repeating the phrase, "The hunger changes them. First inside, then outside." She would say no more on the subject, lapsing back into an unresponsive state before they reached Welch. During one particularly lucid moment, Martha grasped Dr. Thornton's arm with surprising strength and spoke with sudden clarity. "Do you hear it?" she asked. "The voices in the wind? They're not human. They've never been human. They just use human mouths sometimes, when they find someone willing to listen." Before Thornton could respond, Martha's focus seemed to shift to something behind him. Her expression transformed to one of terror, and she retreated into silence for the remainder of the journey. Upon arrival at the hospital, Martha Blackburn was placed under the care of Dr. William Harrison, the facility's senior physician. Her condition was deemed critical, not only due to her physical injuries and exposure, but also because of her severe psychological trauma. Dr. Harrison's initial report indicates that Martha exhibited symptoms consistent with extreme shock and psychological break, a condition then often referred to as nervous collapse. Meanwhile, Sheriff Hatfield continued to coordinate the search for Thomas Blackburn. The discovery of both Elias's body and Martha in a severely traumatized state pointed to Thomas as the likely perpetrator of whatever violence had occurred at the homestead. However, the unusual nature of the evidence, particularly the strange underground room and the ritualistic aspects of Elias's injuries, suggested something far more complex than a simple case of familial violence. The search for Thomas Blackburn would continue for another 11 days, covering increasingly wider areas of McDowell County. Despite the efforts of law enforcement from 3 counties and local volunteers, no trace of him was found, no additional campsite, no body, no reliable sightings. It was as if Thomas Blackburn had simply vanished into the vast wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains. What they did find, however, were disturbing indications that Thomas had spent considerable time in the forest prior to his disappearance. Approximately 3 miles from the Blackburn homestead, searchers discovered a small clearing containing what appeared to be some form of primitive altar, a flat stone positioned deliberately on top of 2 smaller stones, forming a table-like structure. The surface of this stone bore dark stains and carved symbols similar to those found in the cabin. Surrounding the stone were several small piles of bones, which Dr. Thornton later identified as belonging to various forest animals, rabbits, squirrels, and at least 1 fox. The arrangement suggests ritualistic activity, Dr. Thornton noted in his report. The bones had been carefully stripped of flesh and organized in specific patterns radiating outward from the central stone. Most had been broken open, presumably to extract the marrow. What purpose this served remains unclear, though it clearly represents methodical, purposeful behavior rather than random activity. During this period, investigators continued to examine the Blackburn homestead for additional evidence. Their findings only deepened the mystery. In the attic space above the main room, accessible only by a pull-down ladder that had initially gone unnoticed, they discovered what appeared to be Thomas Blackburn's private study area. A small desk held numerous papers, many covered in the same unusual symbols found in the small side room downstairs. Several books on astronomy and natural philosophy, Unusual possessions for a man of Blackburn's background and education were stacked neatly on a small shelf. Most significant was a collection of detailed anatomical drawings, executed with surprising technical skill, depicting human and animal anatomy in various states of dissection. These drawings, according to expert analysis conducted years later, demonstrated a level of anatomical knowledge that would have been highly unusual for someone without formal medical training. Interspersed with these drawings were pages of dense text written in what appeared to be a personal cipher or code that has never been successfully decrypted. The precision of the anatomical renderings is remarkable, noted Dr. Alan Spencer, a medical historian who examined copies of the drawings in 1968. They show a sophisticated understanding of musculature and internal organs that one would typically associate with formal anatomical training. What's particularly notable is how these accurate renderings are interspersed with highly speculative or imaginative elements, structures that don't exist in known anatomy, as if the artist were documenting actual observations, but interpreting them through some peculiar theoretical framework. Another troubling discovery was a collection of small glass vials containing dried plant material and unidentified powders, carefully labeled with symbols rather than words. Analysis of these materials conducted in 1963 identified several known botanical specimens with psychoactive properties, including Jimson weed and certain fungal extracts known to produce hallucinogenic effects. Other substances in the vials defied identification. The combination of these substances suggests someone experimenting with altered states of consciousness, noted Dr. Harold Mercer, the botanist who conducted the analysis. Many indigenous cultures worldwide use similar preparations in shamanic rituals designed to facilitate communication with the spiritual world. The precision of the preparations, careful measurement and combination indicates this wasn't recreational use, but purposeful, systematic experimentation. At the hospital in Welch, Martha Blackburn's condition deteriorated despite the best efforts of Dr. Harrison and his staff. She developed a high fever on February 23rd and began experiencing what the medical reports describe as acute episodes of terror, during which she would attempt to flee her hospital bed while shouting about the hunger in the trees and claiming that Thomas is watching through their eyes. These episodes were not mere delirium, Dr. Harrison noted. During these periods, Mrs. Blackburn displayed remarkable strength and focus, requiring multiple attendants to restrain her. Most disturbing was her insistence that her husband was somehow present in the room, observing her through the eyes of others. She would point to corners of the room, windows, or sometimes directly at hospital staff, claiming, "That's not your eyes looking at me. It's him. It's what's inside him now." On February 25th, during a brief period of apparent lucidity, Martha provided the only substantive testimony about the events at the Blackburn homestead. Dr. Harrison, recognizing the importance of her account, summoned Sheriff Hatfield, who arrived with a court stenographer to document her statement. Martha's testimony, preserved in fragmentary form in court records discovered during a courthouse renovation in 1963, described how Thomas had begun to change in the summer of 1904. According to Martha, her husband had always been a quiet, reserved man, but that summer he began spending long hours alone in the forest, often returning home after dark, with no explanation for his absences. "He started talking about voices in the wind," Martha stated, "said they were teaching him things, secrets about the world and what lives in it. I thought it was just talk. Men in these hills sometimes get strange notions when they spend too much time alone." By mid-July, Thomas had begun keeping a journal, writing in it obsessively, often by candlelight, late into the night. He became increasingly secretive about its contents, hiding it when Martha entered the room. Around the same time, he began collecting unusual objects from the forest, oddly shaped stones, particular types of fungi, bones and antlers from animals he hunted. These items he stored in a chest that remained locked at all times. He told me he was learning about the true nature of the forest, Martha recalled, said there were powers in the hills older than man, older than time itself. He claimed they had chosen him for something important, though he wouldn't say what. When I suggested he speak to Reverend Miller about these notions, he became angry, saying the church had spent centuries hiding the truth about what really lived in the wild places. By fall, Thomas had begun constructing the underground room behind their cabin, working mostly at night. When Martha questioned him about it, he claimed it was for special storage for the winter. Around the same time, she noticed Thomas writing constantly in a journal he kept hidden from her, and drawing the strange symbols that would later be found throughout the cabin. "I found him once, standing in our bedroom just staring at the wall," she stated. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was listening to the hunger. Said it was speaking through the wood because the trees remembered when they were alive in the forest. He told me everything that came from the forest still belonged to it, still heard its voice. Even the boards of our cabin, even us. Martha described how Thomas began conducting what he called feedings in the forest at night. He would leave the cabin after dark carrying small animals he had trapped, rabbits, squirrels, occasionally a fox or raccoon. He would not return until dawn, often covered in dirt and blood that he claimed came from preparing the offerings. He said the hunger needed to be fed, Martha testified, said it had been starving for decades because people had forgotten the old ways. He said if it wasn't fed in small ways, it would eventually demand a greater feeding. The most disturbing part of Martha's testimony concerned the weeks immediately preceding the family's disappearance. She described how Thomas had begun conducting what he called preparations in the underground room, often joined by his brother Elias, who initially seemed to share Thomas's growing obsession. The nature of these preparations was not explicitly stated in Martha's testimony, but she indicated they involved the unusual implements later found hanging from the ceiling of the underground room. They would bring things back from the forest, she stated, things they had caught or found. Thomas said they were necessary for understanding the hunger. In early January 1905, Martha claimed that Thomas began to exhibit physical changes. His eyes changed first, she stated. The color seemed wrong, too dark, like looking into deep water. Then I noticed his movements were different, more fluid but somehow wrong, like each limb was moving slightly out of time with the others. When he spoke, sometimes his voice would change mid-sentence, becoming deeper or higher, as if someone else was speaking through him. According to Martha, a rift developed between the brothers in early February. Elias, apparently disturbed by the direction of Thomas's activities, threatened to travel to Welch and alert the authorities. This led to increasing tensions in the household, culminating in a violent confrontation on the night of February 14th. Martha's description of this final night at the homestead is fragmented and often incoherent. She recalled awakening to the sounds of a struggle from the main room of the cabin. When she investigated, she found Thomas standing over Elias, who was bound to a chair. Thomas was allegedly speaking in a voice that wasn't his own, reciting what Martha described as words that didn't sound like any language I ever heard. When Martha attempted to intervene, Thomas allegedly turned to her and said, "The hunger has chosen me, Martha. It needs to be fed." Elias rejected the gift, "But I won't." What followed, according to Martha's testimony, was a series of events so disturbing that portions were redacted even from the official court record. What remains indicates that Thomas subjected Elias to some form of ritualistic procedure using the implements from the underground room, all while reciting the strange words Martha had described. At some point during this ordeal, Martha managed to flee the cabin, taking only a few provisions and running into the forest. "I could hear Thomas calling after me," her testimony concludes, but his voice kept changing, sometimes sounding like him, sometimes like something else altogether. "I hid for days, moving whenever I thought I heard him coming. But the forest, it felt like the trees themselves were watching me, like they were all his eyes now." One final chilling detail from Martha's testimony stands out. She claimed that on her final night in the woods, before being discovered by the search party, she had awoken to find Thomas standing at the edge of her makeshift camp, simply watching her. But it wasn't really him anymore, she stated. His body was different, taller, thinner, moving all wrong, and his face, parts of it didn't look human. When he saw that I was awake, he smiled, but his mouth opened too wide, wider than any mouth should be able to open. He said, "The hunger is almost satisfied, Martha, but it still needs you." Martha Blackburn died on February 27, 1905, 2 days after giving her testimony. The official cause of death was listed as pneumonia resulting from exposure, though Dr. Harrison's private medical notes suggest her death may have been hastened by a profound failure of will to live following extreme psychological trauma. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the Welch Cemetery, as was common practice for individuals whose deaths were associated with disturbing circumstances. What makes this detail particularly unsettling is a note in Dr. Harrison's records indicating that several staff members reported unusual occurrences in Martha's room the night before her death. A nurse claimed to have seen a tall, thin figure standing at the foot of Martha's bed when she entered the room shortly after midnight, though the figure was gone when she returned with an orderly moments later. Another staff member reported hearing what sounded like whispering in a language I didn't recognize, coming from the supposedly empty room. Most disturbing was the orderly's claim that he found small, damp footprints leading from the window to Martha's bed the morning after her death, footprints that he described as shaped wrong, too narrow, and with toes too long to be human. The search for Thomas Blackburn was officially suspended on March 4, 1905. Sheriff Hatfield's final report on the case concluded that Thomas had likely perished in the wilderness, either from exposure or by his own hand, though no body was ever recovered to confirm this theory. The report recommended that the case be closed and classified as a murder-suicide resulting from acute mental deterioration. However, what followed suggests that authorities were far more disturbed by the Blackburn case than this straightforward conclusion would indicate. Within weeks of closing the investigation, unusual steps were taken to essentially erase the incident from public record. The Blackburn cabin and all structures on the property were burned to the ground on March 18, 1905, by order of county officials, an action officially explained as a public health measure, but highly unusual for the time and place. All evidence collected from the property, including Thomas's journals and drawings, was supposedly transferred to state authorities, but subsequently disappeared from record. Newspaper accounts of the incident became increasingly sparse and vague, with the final mention appearing in the Welch Daily News on April 2, 1905, consisting of a brief notice that the unfortunate matter in Beartown has been resolved to the satisfaction of authorities. Perhaps most telling was the apparent effort to discourage settlement of the area surrounding the former Blackburn property. County tax records from 1905 through 1920 show the land was designated as unsuitable for habitation, despite having no obvious geographical or environmental features that would warrant such a designation. Local oral history suggests that county officials quietly advised residents to avoid the area, though no official documentation of such warnings exists. What makes this systematic erasure particularly notable is the involvement of individuals far beyond the local authorities. Records in the state archives, discovered in 1972, indicate that representatives from the federal government, specifically from an obscure division of the Department of Interior, visited McDowell County in April 1905 and requested all materials related to the Blackburn case. The purpose of this federal interest was never documented, nor was the ultimate disposition of the transferred materials. The story of the Blackburn family might have been entirely lost to history were it not for the chance discovery of sealed court records during the renovation of the McDowell County Courthouse in 1963. Construction worker Raymond Carter discovered a small metal box that had been concealed within a wall cavity during an earlier renovation. The box contained partial transcripts from the inquest into the Blackburn case, along with Sheriff Hatfield's personal notes and several photographs of the homestead and the underground room. These materials were briefly examined by county officials before being transferred to state archives in Charleston. However, within months of this transfer, the records were classified as historical materials of a sensitive nature and removed from public access. Attempts by historians and journalists to view these materials in subsequent decades have been consistently denied. Carter later claimed in a local newspaper interview that among the documents he briefly viewed before turning them over to authorities were several photographs that deeply disturbed him. There was one picture of that underground room, Carter stated. Something was hanging from the ceiling that I couldn't make sense of at first. It wasn't until later that I realized what I was seeing. It looked like a human skin, but all wrong somehow, like it had been stretched or altered. I don't know if it was real or some kind of sick prop, but I still have nightmares about it. One individual who claimed to have seen the complete file before its restriction was Dr. Eleanor Richards, a historian researching Appalachian folk beliefs at West Virginia University in 1964. Though legally prevented from discussing specific details of the case, Dr. Richards published a scholarly article in 1967 titled Isolation and Psychological Deterioration in Appalachian Communities, 1880-1920, which many believe draws heavily on the Blackburn case without explicitly naming it. In this article, Richards discusses what she calls a documented case from southern West Virginia involving a family whose prolonged isolation in a remote hollow appears to have facilitated an elaborate shared psychosis resulting in ritualistic violence informed by a syncretic blend of local folk beliefs and idiosyncratic cosmological delusions. She notes that the case demonstrates how geographical isolation can create conditions where reality itself becomes negotiable, and the boundaries between the internal and external world dissolve. What makes Richards's article particularly notable is her discussion of transformation beliefs prevalent in certain isolated Appalachian communities, specifically the notion that prolonged isolation in the wilderness could lead to a physical and mental transformation of the individual. The possessed person is believed to gradually transform, both mentally and physically, into something neither fully human nor fully other, a liminal entity belonging simultaneously to the human and natural worlds. Richards's academic career was cut short when she took an indefinite leave of absence from the university in 1968, following what colleagues described as a research trip to McDowell County from which she returned profoundly changed. She subsequently relocated to Arizona, where she lived in relative seclusion until her death in 1996, never returning to her previous research topics. These beliefs, she wrote, often involve the concept of a hunger or presence within the forest that can, under specific circumstances, take possession of individuals who open themselves to its influence. In private correspondence with a former colleague discovered after her death, Richards alluded to experiences during her research trip that had fundamentally altered her understanding of the Blackburn case. What I found in those hills, she wrote, cannot be reconciled with any conventional academic framework. Some doors once opened cannot be closed. Some knowledge cannot be unlearned. I came seeking historical documentation, and instead found something watching me through the trees, something that knows my name and follows me still, even here in the desert, thousands of miles away. The Blackburn case resurfaced briefly in public consciousness in 1978, when journalist Michael Davenport attempted to produce a documentary on unsolved crimes in Appalachia for a Charleston television station. Davenport's research led him to interview several elderly residents of McDowell County who had been adults at the time of the incident. Though most claimed to know little about the specifics, several recalled the atmosphere of fear that pervaded the region in the spring of 1905. One interviewee, Howard Miller, then 84 years old, recalled how his parents and other adults would speak in hushed tones about what happened to the blackburns and how for months afterward people avoided traveling alone in the forests around Beartown. Miller also claimed that several families moved away from the area that spring, abandoning properties that had been in their families for generations. Something went through those hills like a sickness, Miller stated in his interview. Not a sickness of the body, but of the mind. People who'd been neighbors for decades stopped trusting each other. Doors that used to stay unlocked were suddenly barred at night. Folks started noticing things in the forest they hadn't seen before, movements in the trees, sounds that didn't belong. Miller described how his father, formerly an avid hunter, had returned from a hunting trip in the area near the Blackburn property, visibly shaken, and refused to enter the forest again. He wouldn't talk about what he saw, Miller recalled, just said the forest had changed and wasn't safe anymore. He sold his rifles the next week and never set foot under the trees again. Most telling was Miller's recollection of a local taboo that emerged following the Blackburn incident. For years afterward, nobody would go into certain parts of those woods, especially not after dark. There was a hollow about 2 miles from where the Blackburn place had been. Locals called it Hungry Hollow. Parents would warn their children that if they went there, the hunger in the trees would get them. I don't know what they meant by that exactly, but the way they said it, you knew it was something terrible. Davenport's documentary was never completed. According to former colleagues, he abandoned the project after a research trip to the former Blackburn property. Though he never publicly explained his decision, associates reported that Davenport returned from this trip visibly shaken, describing an overwhelming sense of being watched. While in the area, he specifically mentioned hearing whispering sounds from the trees, as if the wind were forming words. Most disturbing was his claim that upon reviewing audio recordings made during the trip, he could discern what sounded like a human voice beneath the normal forest sounds, repeating the phrase, "Feed the hunger," over and over. Davenport subsequently accepted a position with a news station in Pittsburgh and reportedly refused to discuss the Blackburn case again. According to a former colleague, Davenport destroyed all his research materials related to the case before leaving Charleston. He said some stories shouldn't be told, the colleague recalled. Said sometimes knowledge isn't just dangerous, it's contagious. The land where the Blackburn homestead once stood has remained uninhabited to this day. In 1972, the area was incorporated into the Monongahela National Forest, effectively placing it under federal protection and further restricting access. Forest Service maps mark the area as a natural preservation zone, though no specific ecological or environmental features are cited to justify this designation. What makes this designation particularly curious is the absence of any clear environmental justification. The area contains no rare species, no unique geological features, and no historical structures that would normally warrant special protection. Yet Forest Service regulations specifically prohibit overnight camping within a 3-mile radius of the former Blackburn property, and rangers are instructed to discourage hikers from entering the area, citing vague safety concerns related to unstable terrain. Periodic attempts by historians and researchers to investigate the site have been consistently denied by Forest Service officials, who cite various administrative and environmental concerns. Those few who have visited the general area report an unusual absence of wildlife and a pervading silence that many find unnerving. It's not just quiet, noted Dr. James Harlan, an anthropologist who briefly visited the region in 2010. It's a qualitatively different kind of silence than you typically encounter in forests. There's an oppressive quality to it, as if something is actively suppressing the normal sounds of the woods. Even on a spring day, you don't hear birds or insects. The wind moves the branches, but somehow doesn't make the usual rustling sounds. It's profoundly unsettling in a way that's difficult to articulate. In 1998, folklorist Dr. Rebecca Williams conducted interviews with residents of contemporary McDowell County as part of a broader study on the evolution of Appalachian folklore. She discovered that while specific knowledge of the Blackburn case had largely faded from local memory, elements of the story appeared to have been incorporated into regional folk beliefs and cautionary tales. Williams documented several variations of a local legend about hungry trees or the watching forest, typically used to warn against venturing too deeply into certain remote areas. These stories often feature a common motif. A solitary individual who spends too much time alone in the forest begins to hear voices carried by the wind, eventually becoming changed in ways that render them no longer fully human. The most common version involves a hunter or trapper who begins to perceive a hunger in the forest, Williams wrote. This hunger is described variously as a presence, a voice, or simply a feeling of being watched. It offers knowledge or power in exchange for feedings, initially small animals, but with escalating demands that eventually culminate in human sacrifice, often of family members. The transformed individual is described as physically altered, with elongated limbs, distorted features, and the ability to move through the forest with unnatural speed and silence. What makes these folklore elements particularly interesting is that they appear to be largely unique to the regions surrounding the former Blackburn property. Similar motifs do not appear in the folk traditions of neighboring counties, suggesting a point of origin specific to the McDowell County area and roughly contemporaneous with the Blackburn incident. Perhaps most intriguing is Williams's documentation of local beliefs about certain trees found specifically in the area around Beartown. Several informants mentioned trees with unusual growth patterns, specifically trunks that appear twisted in unnatural directions. These trees are said to have been touched by the hunger and are considered dangerous to approach or touch. According to local belief, if one places an ear against such a tree, one can hear whispering voices offering knowledge in exchange for unnamed sacrifices. The most recent development in the long, fragmented history of the Blackburn case came in 2012, when anthropologist Dr. James Harlan published a controversial paper suggesting that the incident might represent more than a simple case of isolation-induced psychosis. Harlan, who specializes in the study of ritual practices across cultures, noted striking similarities between the fragmentary descriptions of Thomas Blackburn's activities and certain obscure ritualistic traditions documented in widely separated indigenous cultures around the world. In numerous traditions, from Siberian shamanic practices to certain restricted Amazonian rituals, we find accounts of procedures intended to facilitate communication with what practitioners describe as consciousnesses or entities that exist within natural features, most commonly within trees or forests. Harlan points to specific common elements that appear in both the Blackburn case and these diverse traditions. The use of psychoactive substances derived from local plants, periods of isolation in wilderness settings, ritualistic markings or carvings on both objects and the practitioner's body, and the concept of feeding or nourishing the entity through offerings of increasing significance. What's remarkable, Harlan wrote, is not just the presence of similar ritualistic elements across unconnected cultures, but the consistency of their reported effects. Most intriguing, Harlan notes, is the consistent theme of transformation, the belief that through these practices, the human practitioner gradually takes on characteristics of the non-human entity with which they communicate. This transformation is described as both psychological and physical, with the individual becoming a kind of intermediary between human and non-human realms. Harlan's paper stops short of endorsing supernatural explanations, instead suggesting that such widespread ritualistic similarities might point to universal psychological structures that, under certain conditions of isolation and stress, manifest in remarkably similar patterns of belief and behavior across otherwise distinct cultural contexts. However, in private correspondence with colleagues, Harlan allegedly expressed more speculative views. According to one associate who wished to remain anonymous, Harlan had come to believe that the Blackburn case represented something beyond psychological phenomena. Jim became convinced that there was something real in those hills, the colleague stated, not necessarily supernatural in any religious sense, but perhaps some kind of localized phenomenon that human minds perceive and interpret through cultural frameworks. He talked about thin spots where the boundary between consciousness and environment becomes permeable. He believed the Blackburn incident occurred at one such location. Academic reception to Harlan's work was largely negative, with critics accusing him of sensationalizing a tragic case of mental illness and family violence. Shortly after the paper's publication, Harlan's request to access the sealed Blackburn records was denied, and his application for a research permit to visit the former Blackburn property was similarly rejected. Curiously, Harlan's academic output ceased completely following these rejections. He took a sabbatical from his university position in late 2012, ostensibly to work on a book expanding his theories. However, no such book was ever published, and Harlan did not return to his position when the sabbatical ended. Attempts to contact him at his last known address in Vermont have been unsuccessful, and colleagues report no communication from him since early 2013. The last word on the Blackburn case may belong to Sheriff William Hatfield, who led the original investigation in 1905. In a personal letter to his brother, written shortly before his retirement from law enforcement in 1912 and discovered among family papers in 1987, Hatfield reflected on the case that had clearly continued to trouble him. Of all the darkness I've encountered in my years as sheriff, nothing compares to what we found in those hills that February. The official record states that Thomas Blackburn was a man who lost his mind to isolation and turned against his family. That's the story we gave the papers, the story we gave the town. It's the story I've told myself on bright days when the world seems rational and orderly. But in the dark hours before dawn, when truth has a way of pressing itself upon a man, I know there was something else in those hills, something that found Thomas Blackburn before we did. I've spent years convincing myself that what Martha told us were the ravings of a traumatized mind, that the symbols covering those walls were the product of madness, not method, that the instruments in that underground room were merely the tools of a deranged man, not something else. Yet I cannot explain why, 7 years later, I still avoid the forests around Beartown, why the sound of wind through trees sometimes stops me cold, or why on certain nights I wake suddenly from sleep with the absolute certainty that something is watching me through my window, something hungry and patient and old. Last month I received a letter. No return address, postmarked from a town in Maine I've never heard of. Inside was a single page covered in those same symbols we found in Blackburn's cabin, and a brief note in what I recognize as Thomas Blackburn's handwriting, though changed somehow, more angular and precise. It said only, "The hunger has spread beyond the hills. It grows stronger with each feeding. Soon it will not need me to act as its voice." I burned the letter, but I cannot burn the fear that came with it. Some evils, once encountered, leave a stain that never washes clean. Sheriff Hatfield died of natural causes in 1916. His letter was never made public during his lifetime, and the Blackburn case remained officially closed, explained as a tragic but straightforward instance of mental breakdown and violence. Yet the questions remain. What really happened to the Blackburn family in those remote Appalachian hills? What was the nature of the hunger that Thomas Blackburn described in his final journal entry? Why did authorities go to such lengths to erase the incident from public record? And perhaps most disturbingly, if Thomas Blackburn did indeed survive, where did he go? Local hunters occasionally report strange experiences in the forests near the former Blackburn property. They describe an unnatural silence, a sensation of being watched, and sometimes glimpses of a tall, thin figure moving with unusual fluidity between distant trees. Most dismiss these accounts as campfire tales or the product of overactive imaginations. But some of the older residents of McDowell County still warn against venturing into certain hollows, especially after dark. The trees remember, they say, and what lives in them is always hungry. The forests of McDowell County keep their secrets. The wind still whispers through the trees around the clearing where the Blackburn homestead once stood. And according to local hunters who occasionally venture near the area, that particular hollow remains unusually silent, as if something there is listening, watching, and waiting. For those inclined to dismiss this account as mere folklore or sensationalism, consider this. The area surrounding the former Blackburn property remains one of the least studied parts of the Monongahela National Forest. No biological survey has been conducted there since its incorporation into the federal land system. No trail maps mark its location. And Forest Service employees, when pressed on the matter, are known to change the subject or refer questions to administrative offices that never seem to respond. In 2015, a small group of hikers reportedly ventured into the restricted area, ignoring warning signs and the advisories of local rangers. Only 3 of the original 5 returned. Their account of what happened to their companions was so inconsistent and implausible that authorities initially suspected foul play. However, an extensive search found no trace of the missing hikers. The 3 survivors maintained their story, that something had emerged from the trees at dusk, something that moved with impossible speed, and called to them in voices that sounded eerily like their own. They described a tall, emaciated figure with elongated limbs and features that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. The official report concluded that the missing hikers had likely become separated from the group and succumbed to exposure or accident in the rugged terrain. The survivors' account was attributed to panic, confusion, and possible hallucinatory effects from wild mushrooms they admitted to sampling earlier in the day. The case was closed, the area's restrictions were reinforced with additional signage, and the incident faded from public attention. Yet occasionally, late at night in certain rural taverns in McDowell County, you might hear whispered conversations about the hunger in the trees and the fate of those who venture too deep into certain hollows. Old-timers will tell you that on particularly still nights, if you stand at the edge of the forest and listen carefully, you can sometimes hear a voice carried on the faintest breath of wind, a voice that sounds almost, but not quite, human, whispering promises of ancient knowledge in exchange for simple offerings. Some secrets remain buried, not because they are forgotten, but because they are too disturbing to acknowledge. In the quiet hollows of Appalachia, where the modern world still maintains only a tenuous presence, perhaps some doors are best left closed, some forests best left unexplored, and some hungers best left unfed.